Mark Cooper, who is a partner and attorney at the Jaffe Law Firm. Mark, welcome to the Megacast.
Morning, Tyler. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Before we get into the meat of the interview, how are you? How's your team and your family? Everybody holding up okay?
We are. So far, we've been able to manage this and learn how to effectively work at home to some degree, particularly with all the kids here and all the activity associated with that. But we're doing fine.
That's great to hear, and it's a tough time. There's a whole host of issues that the coronavirus pandemic has brought up just across the board, but even on the legal end as well for businesses and for individuals. A lot of what you deal with as far as those legal issues is concerned involves insurance, and one of those coverage issues is business interruption insurance. For novices like me who haven't been to law school or don't work in insurance, explain this for us. What is business interruption, and what is that coverage like?
Sure. So business interruption is probably, for most people out there, the issue in the insurance world right now you're reading the most about in the news and hearing the most controversy about, because as a general rule across the board, most insurance companies are saying that these claims are not going to be covered. And this is the impact to the various businesses that we are seeing that is the greatest. So what business interruption expense is designed to do is to replace business income that is lost by a business as the result of what's referred to in the insurance industry as a covered event that interrupts the business operations. So a general or very broad example that you might ordinarily hear about is if a building is destroyed by fire and the company that operates in it can't perform its ordinary business functions any longer. If you have business interruption expense for a certain period of time, those losses can be covered.
Well, this isn't something necessarily that is this something that's included in most policies? Is this something that you have to add on?
So it's both. Most small business owners, which probably is the bulk of the people listening to this program, likely have some component of business interruption coverage in what is called a package policy that they buy for their company. So with that package policy, they're usually buying property insurance, general liability insurance that protects you against things like the slip and falls you always hear about. And you get some, usually about 12 months of business interruption expense within that coverage. Like anything else, if you're willing to pay more money, you can extend that time period and buy extended coverage. But even if you have just the basic coverage, it really is designed to include things like your loss of income plus all the operating expenses you lose during the time you're not in business, like payroll, taxes, loan payments you're obligated to make, even moving to a temporary location while your existing premises is rebuilt.
In a lot of insurance claims, you have to provide some sort of information or some sort of proof that makes that helps you prove your claim is legitimate. Is there anything that businesses have to have prepared in order to provide to the insurance company in order to have this business interruption insurance claim executed properly?
So there's a number of issues that are going to arise in the legal landscape related to these claims. The first, sort of setting aside how you would document a claim for the moment, is whether these claims are even going to be covered. And so the nature of the loss in the first instance is what companies are going to have to look at the most closely in conjunction with either their agent or broker or a lawyer who has experience in this area. And that's because most of these claims, the way the policies are written, require that there first be direct physical loss or damage to the property. And as you can tell from that definition, something like a pandemic, COVID-19, for instance, doesn't necessarily cause actual physical loss or damage to your premises. It instead maybe has to be cleaned up, sort of like some of the other issues we've seen in the insurance context in the past, like the SARS outbreak several years ago, or even the mad cow disease that went around. In those situations, most courts have said, unless there's some tangible difference to the property, the coverage doesn't even get triggered. So step one is to look at the language in each of these policies because they are all very different, and determine whether in fact the claim is even covered. Once you reach that first issue, then we have to deal with the exclusions and all the other things people get frustrated about with insurance policies. So it is an uphill push in most of these situations.
And what legal backing or legal action can these companies take if they're making these claims? And obviously, with the pandemic, in most cases, you're not going to see that physical damage to the building or be able to prove that any sort of contamination necessarily. What legal action can they take to maybe help them get these insurance coverages and execute that claim that they desperately may need to keep their business alive?
It would be great, Tyler, if I could give you just a black and white answer to that. And I think that would alleviate a lot of concern that most of these businesses have. But like most other legal issues, every state has addressed these claims differently. And as a starting point, insurance policies are reviewed by courts like any other contract. So the language in these policies are what drives how they get interpreted. In some states, like Michigan, for example, most of the courts that have addressed similar types of situations in the past have already said there has to be some kind of tangible damage to the property. Other courts in other states are a little more forgiving. There are, for example, situations where in big processing plants, there's been chemicals released in the air, and the only real issue is smell or odor, like ammonia, for instance. And courts in those jurisdictions have said that's sufficient. That does actually trigger the coverage. So I think what we're starting to see now is a growth of litigation against these insurance companies. One, just to put pressure on them broadly to maybe deal with what's becoming a broader social issue for these businesses. And two, there are some unique scenarios where the coverage could be afforded if the policy is written favorably to the insured.
So what do you see the future of business interruption coverage being? How will this change maybe how policies are constructed in the future? Maybe some legal changes in insurance law that may be a result of a situation like a pandemic that people didn't imagine was going to happen in our lifetime, didn't imagine would be making such a huge impact on their business and that they would need some sort of insurance coverage for. Do you see there being any changes with that pressure you spoke of going forward after this crisis is over?
Well, I think there's the potential for some positive change, and the more likely outcome is to make these policies even more stringent in terms of how they get interpreted. Because the insurance industry, if nothing else, is reactive to the kinds of risks that they face once they experience them. We've seen the insurance company tighten language and policy forms over the years in reaction to different kinds of large-scale crises, like the 9/11 event, for instance, after Hurricane Sandra, after the SARS outbreak. The policy language often changes and becomes more favorable to the insurance company. But what you see in exchange for that is various insurance companies will start offering very specific policies for very specific risks. So there's a company referred to as ISO. It's the Insurance Services Organization that sort of collaborates standard policy forms. It's already releasing a couple of potential very specific COVID coverage related endorsements that people can buy. There's no details about it yet and no idea what the pricing would be, although I would assume it would be very high while we're in the midst of all this. But you'll see some changes like that where there are opportunities to buy specific coverage. The other area where there's the potential for some positive development is with the government. In the past, we've seen the government back certain coverage forms when it's become required to really support businesses. We saw in particular with the terrorism coverage that's now required to be offered as a part of commercial policies. That's often backed up to a certain percentage of losses by the government. So there's already talk about some legislation to create a similar kind of fund or program for pandemic related losses. That's just in its infancy, but that's probably the most likely place people will see some relief and change.
Well, and if that is the case, where they see some relief and some change, that does include new policy law going forward. That would include different kinds of disasters like a pandemic that affects a business in a different way. I think that's something that could be a really positive change, even if it's just a slight change in and of itself. But hypothetical situation, you're months down the road after this is all said and done, someone's starting a new business. Let's say hypothetically, I'm starting a business, Megacast Industries. Mark Cooper, attorney at Jaffe Law Firm. What should businesses do as they're getting their business insurance set and ready to go as they're developing their business to make sure that they have what can they do in partnership with their attorney, with their legal counsel, in order, and with their insurance company, in order to make sure that they have the coverages that they may need in the event of an unforeseen disaster like this COVID-19 pandemic, so that they can avoid situations where now they need insurance, they need this claim to go through so they can keep their business alive in the next disaster that comes along.
So there's a number of things that we generally look at when people are developing a new insurance program. And one of the things I always have to remind people of, and it's a difficult conversation often to have, is insurance doesn't cover everything. We can do our best as a risk management process to push the risk off to the insurance company to the extent possible, but you can't buy insurance for every potential loss, and you can't insure every potential claim. So what we generally do, working in conjunction with a client's insurance company through its agent, is just develop where the most likely risks are and what its highest level of risk is, and try to tailor what the company is purchasing through the insurer to best meet that. There's no guarantee that all claims are going to be covered, and no way to actually develop a program that would do it, but we can work around it as close as possible.
And transitioning now, as people are coming back into society, they're going back to work. More people are going to the stores, and more stores are opening up, and presumably in the hopefully near future, we'll have people foot traffic back in their stores. People are going to parks. That brings up another issue, which is liability. Liability claims for insurance, and liability litigation potentially against companies or against organizations. What protections do businesses have from an insurance perspective and a legal perspective that may help shield them from those damages? And what can they do to maybe avoid potential litigation in those scenarios?
So those are two different questions in the context of risk management and insurance, and I'll try to give you a brief answer on each of them. The first is, what can you do with respect to avoiding or limiting your liability? And right now, what we're generally advising clients is that education for your consumers or people coming onto your property is key. So to the extent that you can advise people that they have their own obligations to protect themselves as well as others on your property, by adhering to the social distancing guidelines and the other recommendations that the CDC is making, then that goes a long ways towards establishing some personal responsibility in that environment. Similarly, most businesses, as long as they are acting reasonably under these circumstances by taking the proper precautions to clean their property and doing all the other things consistent with those same guidelines, that's the best way to protect themselves. I think, as you probably know, in this society, there's no way to limit personal injury lawsuits very effectively. Lawyers are going to pursue them. I would anticipate that this is going to be the next boom of litigation for a considerable amount of time. And so that raises your next question, and that is, does insurance generally cover these types of claims if someone's injured on the premises as a result of COVID? And the answer very broadly is probably yes. Most commercial general liability policies are going to be very different from property policies and should provide a defense to most companies if they get sued for these kinds of losses. I don't anticipate that will be free of all fights with the insurance industry, but more broadly speaking, that is going to be a positive thing for most people with that kind of insurance.
And general liability insurance, what kind of protections does that generally provide to businesses?
So general liability insurance is the kind of insurance you think about in the context of personal injury lawsuits. So if someone slips and falls in a grocery store, for example, and then sues that company later because they claim, there was a wet spot on the floor that caused them the fall, the general liability insurance will provide that company with a lawyer to defend the case, and then it'll pay any judgment or settlement up to whatever policy limits you purchased for those losses. So it protects you almost entirely for those kind of claims.
And do you imagine that claims may be being made against companies, in this case with COVID out there, would generally be protected under these policies?
Yes, our initial review is that most of these claims should be covered. We also think there's a lot of defenses that are going to develop to these claims. For instance, how do you ever establish that you developed COVID, for example, by going to the grocery store, when that risk is the same risk you face everywhere else in the world right now? So there's a lot of issues that are going to have to be litigated over probably several years as this evens out. But generally speaking, I think most insurance companies will be there to backstop the claims that are brought against their insurers.
He is Mark Cooper, partner and attorney at the Jaffe Law Firm, here with us on 89.3 Lakes FM, 88.1 WBFH, the Biff, WAHS, 89.5 Avondale Community Radio on the Megacast, also joined on television on Birmingham Municipal Access TV, or BAMA, and on Civic Center TV, and on Facebook Live on the West Bloomfield Police Department's Facebook page. Mark Cooper, do you mention there being what kind of third-party claims are likely to be filed in the immediate aftermath and going forward in the intermediate during this COVID-19 crisis?
I think the most likely kind of claim you're going to see is people claiming that they were exposed to COVID as a result of a company not properly maintaining its premises. So whether that is a tenant in a building, or someone in a retail establishment or a hospitality place like a restaurant or a movie theater or other event venue, those are likely the claims that you're going to see. Probably we'll see claims for both personal injury, where people have had a very difficult time with the illness, and unfortunately probably claims where people have died as a result of developing COVID. Those are the most likely third-party claims. Eventually, we may also see claims against the directors and officers of larger businesses for failure to anticipate these losses or manage them properly. The outreach on where these claims could go is frankly almost limitless at this point.
Do you imagine there will be more claims made against officers of companies and directors of companies related to like workmen's compensation issues in that case?
I think we've already started to see some of those claims filed. We try to track nationally all the lawsuits that are developing in this area so that we can try to determine what the trends are. We've seen some claims already filed by estates of employees who have died as a result of COVID, and they're claiming that they developed it while they were employed. So I think that we're just seeing the very beginning of the wave on where all this litigation is headed.
Right now, what can businesses do as they plan to return to normal operations and they're executing those return plans? What can they do from a legal standpoint, from an insurance standpoint, from a preparation standpoint, to either avoid the risk of a claim, or if disputes do arise, what can they do to protect themselves going forward?
So to avoid the disputes, I think that the biggest thing is what we talked about a little while ago, and that's the education component and the process of maintaining your own premises as a business owner consistent with all the guidelines that are out there. The best you can do is act as a reasonably prudent business owner in this environment. That's the standard by which you will be gauged to be negligent or to have been reasonable in your conduct. So following those guidelines, and I know there are a million resources out there and a lot of different issues being addressed by lawyers in other specialty areas like employment law, for instance, on how to deal with employees coming onto the premises. So those are all going to be very important things to follow. In terms of defending claims once they're brought, I think that remains to be seen at this point. We haven't really had those develop in any meaningful way yet. Those lawsuits are just now getting filed. I mean, one of the things is I think the science, as I mentioned before, is not well settled yet on how you can even pinpoint when someone actually obtained the virus. So all of those things are going to become important as time goes by and feed into how these claims get resolved.
Mark Cooper, partner and attorney at the Jaffe Law Firm. Anything else you'd like to tell us today on the Megacast? Anything else that we haven't touched on that you believe would be important for our audience, for local businesses to know right now?
The other thing I'd point out is that insurance policies are oftentimes very complex, and they require a careful reading. It's very important to have someone do that for you if you have any concerns about whether coverage is going to be afforded for a loss. Don't just assume your claims aren't covered, although that may be the trend, and perhaps this today sounds a little on the negative side as opposed to optimistic in terms of insurance coverage. That doesn't mean the claims aren't there, and all of these should be examined pretty closely.
And if someone needs to get in contact with you, they have some questions that we maybe didn't cover today, how can they get in contact with you, Mark?
So you can find me on our law firm's website, which is www.jaffelaw.com. That's JAFFELAW.com. We actually have a COVID-19 resource folder on our website. So a lot of the information we just sort of touched on today is available on there. It covers everything from the different government loans we've been discussing to the employment issues to the insurance topics we've been over.
Mark Cooper, partner and attorney at the Jaffe Law Firm. Thank you very much for joining us today.